All right, this is Chapter 7, Lesson 2, Write and Solve Addition Equations. So, the first thing I have is another way to solve equations is to use blank, blank, which undo each other. In those two blanks, you're going to write inverse equations, inverse operations. So, inverse operations undo each other. To solve an addition equation, I can use subtraction because it's an inverse operation. It's the opposite. All right, so let's look at an example. The example I have says solve 8 equals x plus 3. Check your solution. So there are a couple different methods that I can actually use to solve equations. One is actually using a model. So I model the equation using counters for the number and a cup for the variable. So on this side of my equation, I had 8 equals x, which is my cup, plus 3 counters. So I want to remove 3 counters from each side because that tells me what I have left, which will equal the variable. Okay? And there are 5 counters remaining. So my variable has to equal 5. The second method that I can use is actually using symbols, which you'll see more often than not, especially when you get to higher levels of mathematics. So my method 2 is using symbols. 8 equals x plus 3. I subtract 3 from both sides. 8 minus 3 equals 5. Then I can go back and double check by substituting 5 back in for my variable. 5 plus 3 does get me 8. Which is what I was trying to prove in the first place. So using either method, I get a solution of 5. So when you're dealing with any sort of equation, it's all about balancing. It's all about the yin and the yang, balancing your equation using balancing scales, using counters, adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing, using inverse operations. So it's all about balancing. All right, so the first property that I actually want to talk about with you is the subtraction property of equality. Okay? Whatever is subtracted from one side of the equal sign must be subtracted from the other side so that the two sides remain equal. Remember, we talked about that balancing act. You really want to balance whatever you do to one side of the equation, you have to do to the other side of the equation. Okay, so for example, numbers, if I subtract 3 from 5 equals 5, I have to subtract it from both 5's. Otherwise, my equation's no longer equal. Same thing with algebra. X plus 2 equals 3. If I subtract 2 from my left side of the equation, I have to subtract it from the right side of the equation. All right, when you solve an equation by subtracting the same number from each side of the equation, you are using the blank, 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 blank. In those 4 blanks, you're going to write subtraction property of equality. So when you solve an equation by subtracting, you're using the subtraction property of equality. So let's take a look at an example. For number 2, James and Jewel have 245.5 downloaded minutes of music. If James has 132 minutes, how many belong to Jewel? Write and solve an addition equation to find how many minutes belong to Jewel. So we know that James and Jewel have 245.5 minutes together, combined. Okay, and I know that James has 132 minutes. So I can let J represent my variable for Jewel to represent how many minutes of music Jewel has. And I add 132 plus J equals 245.5. So here's my equation. I want to subtract 132 from both sides of my equation. So this is, while you can do this with counters, it'll make your life a little bit easier if you do it with actual symbols, okay? Otherwise, you have to sit there and count 132. That's a lot of counting, okay? So 132 minus 132 leaves me with just J. J is left by itself. 245.5 minus 132 gives me 113.5. So 113.5 minutes belong to Jewel. Okay. Now there are a couple of try it problems out below. I want you to go ahead, pause the video, try them out, and when you're done, we'll go over the answers together. All right, now that you've had a chance to try out the try it problems, let's go over the answers together. So the first one I have is C plus 3 equals 5. So what I can do is I'm looking at addition and I want to use my subtraction property of equality. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides of the equation. This cancels and I'm left with C, and 5 minus 3 equals 2. For letter B, 6 equals x plus 2. Again, I want to subtract. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. This cancels. 6 minus 2 is 4, and I'm left with x on this side of the equation. It doesn't matter which side the variable is on. You can still use the subtraction property of equality as long as you're adding things. So for letter C, I have 3.2 plus x equals 12.45. Again, I subtract 3.2. I'm left with x. And x equals 9.25. For letter D, h plus 15 equals 27. So again, I want to subtract 15 from both sides. So h, this cancels. 27 minus 15 is 12. And then for letter E, suppose Sky had 147.5 minutes of the 245.5 that were downloaded. So again, we're talking about the music minutes that were downloaded, okay? Write and solve an addition equation to find how many minutes belong to Andrew. Okay, so Sky has 147.5 plus A, we're going to use A for Andrew's minutes, equals 245.5. Now I want to subtract 147.5 from both sides. So A equals 98 minutes. So Andrew downloaded 98 minutes. And that is the end of Chapter 7, Lesson 2.